Bibles. Hopefully you brought your Bibles with you this morning, and we're going to be in John's Gospel. John chapter 13 is where we're going to be in just a moment. I'll be joining you there today as well. We are continuing on in our sermon series called Improving Your Serve. And the last time that I was with you, we talked a little bit about what Jesus says about service. And that's not surprising. Jesus had a lot to say about service, but what maybe he said about service was surprising. You see, a lot of us, we've got our own preconceived notions about how to serve, what that looks like, that, service is really for those elite Christians, those who are really wanting to, get the gold star on the God. That's just reserved for them. And somehow if I'm not serving, well, God's going to look past that and it's going to be okay. And what Jesus tells us about service, what we learned the last time we were together, is that listen, service is expected. If you're following after me, if you call yourself a Christian, if you are truly a disciple of mine, then service is going to be what's expected from you. And he goes on to tell a story about a guy who had these workers working for him, and he came in from the field, and you remember that whole thing, right? Well, we gave you 3 statements that we learned from Luke chapter 17 on service. And here's the first. We must not expect God to serve us because we have served him. God's going to serve us. Sometimes we get these expectations in our life that God is going to serve us because, well, I've done my part, and God, I'm expecting that you're going to do your part, But we must not expect God to serve us because we've served him. We also must not expect immediate reward for our service. A lot of times, there is seeds that are planted. There are things that are started, but sometimes those seeds take a long time to grow. And so you may not see the benefits of the work that you're doing and the seeds that you're planting and the service that you're doing. And third and finally, we must see serving as our obligation to Jesus Christ. We must see serving as our obligation to Jesus Christ. Verse 10 says, "So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have only done that which we have ought to have done." And so you see, Jesus is laying it out very nicely, very clearly. Service is a mandate. It's a command. You're asked to do this. You're told to do this. So serve. Well, more than just saying some stuff about service, Jesus showed us some stuff about service. The title of this morning's message is, What Jesus Shows Us About Service. And Brian, I'm going to need some help with the slides this morning. That keyboard's just messing us up here today. But what does Jesus show about service? Next slide, I think, and then you're caught up. There you go. What does Jesus show us about service? Because how many of you would agree that merely than just listening to someone who maybe tell you to do some things, it's a whole lot more meaningful if the person who's telling you to do things actually follows through and does them himself, right? No one would want to sit and listen to a guy teach a seminar on the importance of dental care, right? If this guy was your instructor. I'm thinking that if we were sitting in a seminar, he's like, "Hey, you guys need to brush your teeth and floss and use mouthwash," we'd all be like, "Yeah, because it worked out so well for you," And I don't know about you guys, but as we're entering into the tax season, I'm kind of really fed up with a government that wants to keep me accountable with how I'm spending my money and how I'm earning my money, when in fact they themselves are doing a horrible job of it themselves. You guys feel the same way? It's like, here, you guys, the threat of the IRS is coming in, and they're going to tell you, oh, well, you need to keep records, you need to keep track of. Oh, really? Are you guys doing such a good job of that yourselves? $17 trillion in debt? I get a little sick of that. But today what I wanted to remind you of is that I want to put your mind at ease. Because Jesus, more than just telling us what we should do, more than just sitting there in his lofty throne saying, you guys need to go serve, more than that, we're going to see that Jesus shows us how to serve. He demonstrates it. And I love that. And that brings us to our text this morning in John chapter 13. Let me set the stage for you a little bit here today. It's the last day of Christ's ministry on earth, and I just want to point out some things about Jesus serving. Because what we're about to read is exactly what you would expect Jesus to be all about. But here's the thing. I'm guessing if today you were told you had 24 hours to live, this was going to be your last day to live, that maybe you and I, we would spend our time differently than Jesus spent his time. But this is not surprising for Jesus. Because if you truly understood and believed Jesus when he said in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." That's what he was all about. And so then it makes sense that Jesus, as he's spending his last day with his disciples, spends it doing what we're about ready to read. John chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the very end. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he wrapped himself. Verse 5. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter, and Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus answered him and said, "What I do you do not recognize now, but you will understand hereafter." Peter said to him, "Never shall you wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." And Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, then not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to Peter, "He who has bathed needs only to wash his feet." He's like, calm down, all right? Don't get all overexcited. We're just doing a foot washing here, Peter. You've already had your bath. "But he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you." For he knew the one who was betraying him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined back at the table again, he said to them, "Do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should do as I did to you." There is one of the most humble acts of service. The second, and probably the greatest act of service that Jesus will do in his ministry, will come just a few hours after this event, and that is dying on the cross for the sins of the world. But what I want to do is I want to walk through these verses, and I want to just learn some lessons. Because Jesus shows us something about service. And I believe you could take all of John chapter 13 and you could summarize it with a single phrase, and the single phrase would be this: we must serve faithfully. I believe that's the overwhelming idea, the main thrust of John chapter 13, is that we must serve faithfully. I mean, time and time again, we read in God's word that faithfulness is really important for God's people. Faithfulness is what God desires from us. In fact, one day, when this life is over and when Jesus has called us home, we will get to stand before God. And if you get the good report, you're not going to get, "Hey, you were awesome," or "You rocked," or "You were so cutting edge in your ministry tactics." No one's getting that. The best that Billy Graham can hope for is Matthew 25:21. "Well done, good and faithful servant." That is like the summa cum laude of service, of verbal appreciation from Jesus Christ that we're going to receive. And that's what we're after, being faithful to serve. Let me give you a definition of faithful. Trustworthy and dependable in the performance of duty. Trustworthy and dependable in the performance of duty. Think about our church family just for a moment here. When I say the words trustworthy and dependable in the performance of duty, who comes to mind? Because this church body is filled with people who are trustworthy and dependable. They do what they do. They're not expecting a reward. They're not expecting a thank you. They do it because they love the Lord and they love this church. And boy, there's a lot of people in my mind that I could go spin through the Rolodex in my mind and think about who is it in this church who is trustworthy and dependable in the performance of their duties. Always there, always making church and kingdom things a priority, always serving. And so now what I want to do is I want to give you 4 times to be faithful, 4 difficult times to be faithful based upon John chapter 13 in your service. And here's the first. Be faithful to serve even when life is busy. Hey, anybody's life kind of busy right now? Anybody's schedule a little bit full? As you're looking at your calendar and maybe you're trying to make dates to do something and you look at it, man, I don't know where we're going to fit this in. We've got doctor's appointments. We've got sports activities. We've got work obligations. Life is pretty full. But listen, life for Jesus was very, very busy as well. I mean, you probably missed it, but 2 major events were mentioned in verse 1 that Jesus was dealing with. He had a lot on his plate, and verse 1 talks about it, and it talks about 2 of them, and here's the first. The first thing that Jesus was busy with was the Passover. What do you know about the Passover? Well, verse 1 says, now before the feast of the Passover, well, it's really hard for me to describe to you all that the Passover involves, but it was really, really important. It was a societal celebration. It was a cultural celebration. It was a family celebration. It was a religious celebration. It was all of that. Imagine having Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving all on the same day. That's kind of what the Passover was like for the Jews. And so there were a lot of preparations, a lot of tradition that had to be followed. And to top all of that off, Jesus was going to take this Passover meal and he was going to add new meaning. He was going to take the emblems that were there and he was going to say, this bread represents my body, which was broken for you. And this wine, this represents my blood, which was poured out for you. Do these things to remember me. I'm the Passover lamb. I'm the sacrificial lamb of God. So there were Passover that Jesus was dealing with that was weighing heavy on his mind. But then there was the whole, dying on a cross for the sins of the world that Jesus had going on as well. Looking back at verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father. I found this really interesting. 6 times throughout Jesus' ministry, John records Jesus saying the phrase, my hour has not yet come, my hour has not yet come, not yet, my hour has not yet come, not yet. Well, now we come to John chapter 13, and guess what? My hour is here. My hour of suffering, my hour of tribulation, the crucifixion is nearly at hand. So how many would agree that Jesus had a lot on his plate that night? And yet Jesus is down on his knees, tenderly, lovingly, faithfully washing his disciples' feet. So that leads me to ask the question, what's my excuse? What's your excuse? Because I'm pretty good at coming up with some excuses. Are you too? Pretty good at that? Maybe make note of this. I'm never too busy to serve. I can come up with some pretty lame excuses why I just don't have time. Well, I've got this to do, Lord, and yeah, I know that's going on, but this is more important for me right now. But all of my best excuses on my best day cannot even begin to compare with the example that Jesus lays forth in John chapter 13. There is no circumstance that warrants retreat from serving your master. Let me say that again. There is no circumstance that warrants retreat from serving your master. And I want to clarify, there's nothing wrong with taking a break, okay? Nothing wrong with taking a break. Everybody needs a break. God rested on the 7th day, okay? But what I'm trying to get to the point across is you can't be like, I'm done serving. I put in my dues. I'm done. I'm walking away from that. There's no circumstance that warrants retreat from serving your master. There's no hall pass for that. I must be faithful to serve even when my life is busy. But then also notice, I must be faithful to serve even when I want to quit. Even when I'm tempted to quit and be like, this is too hard. This isn't what I bargained for. The end of verse 1 is really quite beautiful. It says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. He loved them to the end. You see, Jesus didn't get a point in his ministry where like, well, I know we've been through a lot, guys, but listen, I've got a lot on my plate. You guys just go figure it out on your own. I need some time alone. You guys work on it. Now look, I don't doubt for a moment this morning that there are people here today who are going through some really hard things that I know nothing about. There are things in your life that are difficult that because you're a private person, you've kept them to yourself, and that's totally fine, and you're struggling with that on your own. But you're getting to the point in your life where you're like, I'm on the brink, I'm on the edge, God. I need you to speak into my life. I need some encouragement, Lord. It's getting really hard. And I want to suggest to you today that maybe the word that you need to hear from God is this. Having loved his own, he loved them till the end. You see, you're not going to quit. You're not going to give up. Why? Because Jesus Christ didn't quit and give up on you. He saw it through. He finished it. And what was the number one reason that Jesus finished it? What was the number one reason that Jesus didn't quit? It was love. It was love. Remember last time I was with you, I told you that love is the greatest motivation to serve. That, you don't have to like the people that you serve. You don't have to enjoy the service that you're doing, but you do it because you love. You love God and you love his people. And that's why you do the things you do. That's what motivated Jesus to do what he did. Not only on that night in the upper room washing feet, but then a few hours later going to the cross. It was love that kept him there. Remain faithful, even when I feel like quitting. Here's the third thing. Be faithful to serve even when my heart is breaking. Look at verse 2. During the supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus was dealing with a lot. He had the Passover, he had the crucifixion, but then he had this third thing that he was dealing with. And it was a person. You guys know about Judas Iscariot? Man, everybody knows about Judas Iscariot. You could go talk to somebody who's never been to church, who's never read a Bible, look at him and be like, Judas, and they would totally know what you mean. Judas represents great wickedness. Judas is betrayal. Betrayal is a really, really, really hard thing to process. Betrayal is like, I trusted you and I believed in you and I opened my heart to you and I shared some intimate things with you and you used it against me. You betrayed me. You betrayed my trust. Certainly betrayal was on the mind of Jesus during the Passover meal as he was eating it with his friends, with his followers. When you look at all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you read this account of the upper room and the Last Supper and the washing of the feet, you will find 6 phrases that Jesus alludes to, or talks about with betrayal. He says things like, one of you will betray me. The hand of one who dips his hand, the one who dips his hand with me in the bread will betray me. Behold, the hand of my betrayer is on the table. Woe to that man whom the Son of Man has betrayed. One of you will surely betray me. It would be better off if that man had not been born. 6 times recorded in 4 Gospels, betrayal was on the mind of Jesus. Why was that on the mind of Jesus? Because his heart was breaking. He spent 3 years investing in these men whom he hand-selected and said, I want you to follow me. I believe in you. I heard a preacher once say, betrayal is more devastating than the death of a loved one. And I'll be honest with you, when I heard him say that, I was like, wow, over-dramatized much? I didn't fully understand it until it happened. And then I totally understood what he meant. Because you see, with the death of a loved one, even though it hurts and even though it can be shocking at times, death is eventually expected. It's inescapable. We're all going to die. But when you've been betrayed by someone who's been close to you and you don't see it coming, that's really tough. I didn't think it would happen. And when it happens, there's very little that you can do to prepare for it. And it's a hard thing to kind of bounce back from. It's a hard thing to kind of get over. And if you've ever been betrayed, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, well, it's kind of hard to describe. But imagine getting sucker punched in the gut and having the wind knocked out of you, and then having one of your legs cut off. And then someone says, come on, let's go. We got to move on with life. It's really hard. It leaves you feeling stuck. And Jesus Christ was betrayed. And this is something I think we sometimes overlook. Well, it was Judas. We forget that Jesus and Judas were friends. Did you guys forget that? Psalm chapter 41 verse 9 is a prophecy about Jesus and Judas, and it says this: even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And yet, Jesus served Judas as he did everyone else that night, serving faithfully, even when his heart was breaking. And that's a lesson that I needed to hear for sure. Maybe you need to hear that. And finally, the fourth time to serve is this: serve faithfully even when the task isn't enjoyable. Even when the task isn't enjoyable, and that's probably putting it lightly. So it's Jesus' last night on earth, and his last moment shared with all of his disciples gathered together. And they've been through so much in the last 3 years, and Jesus wants to leave his fingerprints on their lives. Hey, if we were going to decide this by committee, any suggestions for what maybe we might expect or want Jesus to do in the upper room with his 12 disciples one last time with them? Hey, how about a great sermon from the master teacher just for them? Kind of a bring them to their knees kind of a sermon. And that'd fire me up. Or how about if he would have said, I did all those miracles and everyone got to see these things and you were a part of those things. But you know what? How about I do one final miracle just for you disciples? You've been with me this whole time. I want to do this. Or how about some strategic ministry planning from the coach? Acts is coming. We're getting ready to be planting churches all over the world. Here's some things that you need to know. But there was no sermon. There was no miracle. There was no pep talk. Nothing like that at all. In fact, there's something quite different. Verse 3 says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, he got up from supper, and he laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. What? Jesus' last teachable moment with his disciples was spent serving? Yeah, absolutely. And talk about a task that wasn't enjoyable. Now you've got to get a picture in your mind's eye to fully understand and appreciate what's going on. And with all due respect to Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, you understand that the disciples weren't all on a table sitting in thrones with a table set before them laden with silverware. You understand that, right? These were fishermen and common men who didn't have a lot of money, but somehow yet managed to scrape money enough together to rent an upper room. And there would be some sort of low-lying table in the middle of the room, and what they would actually do is they would recline on their elbows while they would eat this Passover meal. And you know about the roads back then, right? It was an arid climate. There was no asphalt, no cement, no paving of any kind, really. And so they were essentially walking in sandals on dirt. And so what are your feet going to be like when you get to dinner? Any words come to mind to describe the condition of feet? Dirty, nasty, callousy, stinky, awful. And so what would typically happen is that a servant would come out and take their sandals off, and they would wash their feet to prepare them to eat. We do something similar today, although it's not our feet. What is it that we do before we eat? We wash our hands, right? And your mom does a fingernail inspection. Did you wash your hands? Well, this is kind of like that. They would wash their feet. Why would they wash their feet? Because here in the upper room, you kind of understand this, don't you? That as I'm reclining, your head would be where my feet would be, okay? And it might be a great diet plan, but you would probably lose out on a lot of your appetite, all right? And so what is happening here is that there was no one there to wash their feet. And the picture that I have in my mind's eye is that these disciples, they arrive on the scene, they're in this upper room. Where's the servant to wash my feet? And they're complaining. Hey, way to go, guys. You guys rented this room, you made the preparations, but you forgot the servant. Bravo, fellas. Good job. And while the arguing and the complaining continues, And while they're even, Luke's gospel records, even while they're in this upper room with us, they're still complaining about who's the greatest among them. While they're complaining and arguing without saying a single word, Jesus gets up and begins to do the one task that no one else wanted to do. And so do you think the last lesson that Jesus taught them stuck with them a little bit? Do you suppose they remembered it? And so everyone is sitting there, quiet, no one's saying a word, they're all humble, they all feel about this big right about now. The arguing stopped, the complaining is quieted, all because Jesus served. All because he did the thing that nobody else wanted to do. Well, almost everyone was quiet. Except, well, verse 6. So Jesus came to Simon Peter, and Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, you don't wash my feet. Never will you wash my feet." He's always got to have something to say, doesn't he? And Jesus answered him and said, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." And Peter said, "Well, then wash everything. Wash me all." And Jesus said, "No, your feet will be enough. That's all we need to do." And when Jesus was finished, he sits back down and he asks a question. And the question that Jesus left his disciples with is the same question that I want to conclude with this morning. Jesus said to them, "Do you know what I've done to you?" Jesus is like, "This is it, guys. There's no more. We're at the end now." It's almost kind of like a pleading. It's almost like he's pleading with them. Do you get it? I've given you this example. If I, the master, have washed your feet, then what do you think they were expecting him to say? Then somebody here should wash my feet. If I'm your master and I'm good enough to bend down and wash your feet, then you should wash my feet. But that's not what he says. Jesus says, if I, your master, have washed your feet, then you should wash one another's feet. Jesus is like, I've talked about service. I've demonstrated service. What more can be said? This is the example that I've given to my church. Serve. Serve one another faithfully. Put others ahead of yourself. Serve humbly. Serve immediately. Take care of one another until I return. You're going to need each other. Take care of each other's needs. Love one another. Be my church. It isn't always going to be convenient. It isn't always going to be easy. It isn't always going to be fun. But listen, serve one another because I died for you. And I died for the person you're going to serve. That is what Jesus shows us about serving one another.